Hello, hello. Let's see. We got a friend joining already. Hello, Reaper. Trying out. I have like one of these bendy little desk lamps with the, I think they call it a gooseneck. So I just changed the angle because I was told my lighting sucks. So I might have to look into some photography, video, lighting type things to figure some stuff out about lighting. But yeah, I figure as I've been saying with this stream, high production value isn't my goal, but if there's simple things I could do in order to make the production value or the just the stream better in general, then I'd be more than happy to hop on and do that. You turned a goose into a lamp. Oh, we could look up gooseneck lamp. It reminds me of that little that Pixar hopping lamp thing at the beginning of those Pixar movies. You had these flexible things. I guess it does resemble a flexible gooseneck. You have to give a shout out to the attack goose. Oh, we have a WikiHow style image. Part 1. Oh, the goose has found you. Leave before a goose begins to chase you. Reaper says, lighting is better. You just needed any kind of light on your right side in front of you. Okay, yeah. Well, it makes sense. If I just have backlighting with the window, then I am a shadowy, neckbeard looking fellow. Alright, I'm amused by these drawings. Back away slowly if the goose becomes aggressive. In the event the goose starts chasing you, back away slowly. Stay faced towards the goose and use your peripheral vision to guide your movements. Make sure to avoid anything you trip over, as this may give the goose reason to attack. Oh, so if you fall on the ground, then the goose might see an opening, right? So if you probably keeping your head above the goose's attack range, that's probably a good idea. Okay. Remain calm. If you appear frightened or upset, a goose could take this as a sign of aggression. It's a good idea to maintain a calm, neutral demeanor when backing away from a goose. If you're struggling to remain calm, take a few deep breaths as you back away. Keep in mind that while geese can be territorial, an actual physical attack is very rare. Soul disco. Seek medical attention if you're injured. In the event a goose bites you or hits you with its wings, seek medical attention. Oh, I never thought about the goose wing attack. I was thinking mainly about beak attacks. Geese are strong and can cause injury when provoked. You may require stitches or a cast if a goose attacks you. Go to the emergency room for assessment as soon as you get away. But how are you supposed to get away? Here it says do not run. As you keep your eyes on a goose, running is not recommended. A goose sees you running, this may encourage it to chase you more. So clearly it's a good idea to prevent an attack. But if you do get hurt, then you should seek medical attention. But I'm having a problem seeing how helpful this article is. If a goose does start attacking you, what do you do? Is it just assuming that you fight off and defeat the goose? So it looks like 90% of readers found this article found this article helpful. I mean, some of it was helpful, but like, how do you actually get away from the goose? I don't think they answer the question. They say to slowly back away if it becomes aggressive, but in the case that the goose does become aggressive, then what do you do? So you could learn a lot from the internet, but even a site like WikiHow, which might have a lot of very helpful articles, it doesn't seem like it covers everything. So that's a good reminder to always keep your head up, look where you're going, remain calm, and don't trust everything you read on the internet, because while there might be some truth there, nothing is a substitute for really studying something and committing yourself to understanding something. Cool. Okay, enough about geese. So I listed a number of topics for today's stream. The title I have here is Rational Econ-o-maton Edition. The last stream I had some suggestions of some different topics to talk about. One of them was Nash Equilibrium, the Monty Hall Problem. So if you want to see like appealing visual demonstrations of any of these, I'm sure if you go on YouTube, you could find ample explanations for these. These are pretty well-known and documented things. What I wanted to touch on, though, is why are we even talking about little, we could call them kind of games or puzzles, stuff like this to begin with. Because it could be interesting to hear about. You could think about it and experience the Monty Hall problem for yourself. But I think a more important question is to say, why would you even begin talking about something like the Monty Hall problem to begin with? So I thought about, from my own experience, about how I had first heard about these things. And the answer to that is, I was as an undergraduate student, I studied philosophy and East Asian languages because I wanted to learn Chinese and Japanese, Korean. So I liked studying languages a lot. And then also I wanted to make sure I would be able to do writing or critical thinking, reasoning, whatever that might be. So I also chose to major in philosophy, which I heard, of course, people make jokes about how it's a very impractical major, which I wouldn't disagree with. But there are at least some rigorous criteria that go into philosophy if you do it properly. I'm not saying that it's hard to get a philosophy degree. These days it's probably not hard if you put in the money. But if you actually try to understand what people are saying in philosophy and work through arguments and stuff like that, then indeed philosophy could be a very rigorous and challenging area of study to do. And I by no means claim to be a master of it, regardless of what academic credentials I may have in the subject. So I had come from a kind of humanities background, and eventually I decided to go to graduate school for linguistics. One of the main reasons for that was I wanted to continue studying these different languages I had started studying. I didn't achieve the level of proficiency yet that I was aiming for in these, so if I could have an opportunity to continue to study those languages, but then also to sort of shift into a more technical field that maybe I could pursue a career in, then that would be a useful thing to do. So I started to take courses in statistics at the university I was attending, and also I started to read more into popular science generally. I wanted to see, what the people that are supposed to be smart leaders of their fields, what sort of things are they talking about? So like one famous person that is both a linguist by trade and also a popular scientist is this Steven Pinker fellow. We could take a look at his website. Yeah, so we could see he's at Harvard University, Department of Psychology. Right, and then here, this is just the blurb on his website. What's he interested in? Experimental psychologist. So he's doing research on things like language and stuff, but experimental, this is relating to previous topics that we were talking about. He does quantitative studies, so presumably as opposed to linguists who might just come up and make up ideas about how language works and stuff, this guy sounds legit because he does experimental psychology, which will mean taking measurements and having numbers. So yeah, just a little blurb here. Steven Pinker conducts research on a variety of topics in psychology and cognitive science, including common knowledge, things that everyone knows, language acquisition, emotion, the moral sense, rationality, and trends in violence. Yeah, so then this guy, he also has written a number of popular books. So here you can see that he's been featured by like the New York Times and stuff. So a very, you could say, mainstream author. Mainstream in the sense that if you're on the New York Times bestseller list, your books are being widely distributed wherever books are sold, whether that's Amazon or Barnes and Noble bookstores, stuff like that. Okay, so starting to look into popular science, including looking at the works of people like Pinker, who, because I had some background in linguistics, then I would read popular people that had at least some peripheral connection with linguistics. I started to see how one of the big trends in linguistics is this cognitive science and psychology aspects of language stuff that a lot of people were going into. This is related to a couple other topics I could write. Okay, linguistics in popular science, something like that. We could say, so some trends that we're seeing are, experimental psychology. So this is kind of coming from the human side, and then on the other side, then there's natural language processing. And this is how people use computers and all this sort of stuff to analyze massive troves of data. So somebody might do a study on when people say stuff to Alexa, how do people talk to Alexa, and then how do you take those sound bites and parse that and then turn it into something that the computer could recognize. So some recognition, tokenizing. There's all sorts of technical language about what this is doing. And then also, how do you make a computer, quote unquote, understand what a human is saying and then turn that into some useful result? We have a comment from Reaper who said, people tried to cancel Steven Pinker. Yeah, I'm not surprised. A lot of, you start to talk especially about sort of brain stuff and evolution stuff, then I wouldn't be surprised if you got canceled. Oh, another figure. So here we are on YouTube. We're using a relatively modern, cutting edge technology in order to have this stream and speak with one another. About a decade or so ago, podcasts were all the rage. Now, people still listen to podcasts, but I think that now even podcast is a little bit not as cutting edge as like a live stream. Live stream is like peak technology, especially if you have a faster computer and more sophisticated setup than me. Anyways, there's this other guy that I was listening to some. I believe he's spoken with Steven Pinker maybe multiple times. But in my investigations of popular science, I was also looking at this fellow. Oh, we have another guest joining us. Hi, George. We're talking now about the recommended topics from last stream. Two of them were the Monty Hall Problem and Nash Equilibrium. So right now, I am describing how I came to even know of these terms. And the basic story is that studying linguistics and philosophy and stuff, I started to also look into popular science and what the establishment-approved top intellectuals were saying. So I'm just giving a tour. First, I mentioned Steven Pinker, and then I'm mentioning another guy, Sam Harris here, who is his academic credentials that he would say was he's a neuroscientist. So once again, talking about brains and how people work, and naturally, language is a big area of interest that's associated with psychological stuff. So does he just have? Yeah, let's see like what sort of stuff he's talking about. Yeah, so he does some political stuff that I'm not so interested in, but also you could see that there's still a lot of these pop science type topics. So for example, here he's got one, consciousness and the self. So a rebroadcast, paradox of death, belief and identity. Oh yeah, another thing to note about this Sam Harris fellow, he's famous for, he calls himself or he has been called a member of this group or this movement you could term New Atheism. So if I search Sam Harris, yeah, he's probably in there. So here we have the 4 horsemen of the New Atheism, clockwise from top left: Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, and Sam Harris. So this was the sort of cutting edge of popular science in terms of people trying to reach new audiences through popular media. You had these prominent self-proclaimed atheists that would create content, and then they would try to explain aspects of people, of humans, things that interest people, but try to look at it in what they would call more rational terms. And by rational, as an atheist, they would be saying without reference to God or some sort of divinity. In place of that, then they would try to refer to cognitive behavioral principles, that sort of thing. So we're going to get into this term a little bit later. I'm actually curious of looking through the Sam Harris page really quick. So after that, we'll get to this. But people have come up with these things called cognitive biases. So rather than talking about oh yeah, this person did this, and then talking about it in the traditional language, you might explain stuff in terms of morality, thinking about reasons and that sort of term, then we would have this new language, descriptive language, that would come up of cognitive biases in order to explain why people do what they do. So this will all relate to the Monty Hall Problem and Nash Equilibrium and stuff, in the sense that these problems are kind of brought up to show how humans aren't thinking straight like a computer. They aren't thinking rationally in the sense that a computer just calculates and looks at things just as they're given. Instead, humans have biases to see or approach things in ways that would not be rational. So we'll talk about this in a bit. Let me first respond to a comment here, and then we'll look at Sam Harris titles just a bit. So Reaper says, you're referencing this internet phenomenon, new atheism, that needs a bit of introduction because a lot of people are unfamiliar. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so how would I introduce the new atheism? So from my experience, I would say that a lot of people kind of grew up in households or around people that were at least nominally Christian. So people that would say they're Christian in some form or another. And a lot of, especially quite bookish, intelligent sort of people would begin to notice a lot of like inconsistencies or problems, or they would encounter answers from people in their lives who would say like, well, how do I know that this is true? And maybe their youth group leader or something would just be like, well, it's just faith. Like, you just know because you have to believe, something like that. So you had a lot of people say, okay, what we kind of grew up learning about and understanding to be religion is unsatisfactory to us. Then lo and behold, in popular media on the internet and stuff, you had some voices coming out that were talking about how the latest scientific advances, so in the Wikipedia page, like Dawkins, it's like a biologist, a prominent biologist, Sam Harris, neuroscientist. So these people that are at the forefront of academic research in terms of they're at least talking to or connected with a lot of the really big money, big brain type research. These people caught the attention and interest. A lot of people that were seeking an alternative to sort of a very hand-wavy religious teaching that they had been taught. Okay, so Reaper says, I'm just saying that it was a phenomenon of the internet, especially YouTube a few years ago, and not just random atheists writing books. Yeah. So I think, like I mentioned, Sam Harris, that he, that I found him listening to his podcasts. So I was going to say that one of the ways in which these people's content spread a lot was that they embraced a lot of the new methods of reaching audiences and new platforms for disseminating information. So it wasn't just that they were famous people and they wrote some books and those books could be found at bookstores. Like, more so than that, as I was saying, like Sam Harris, now I think YouTube streaming is kind of cutting edge. But back in the day, when even just posting any YouTube video or having a website that consistently had a podcast, this sort of thing, that was kind of cutting edge. So a lot of people that were on the internet and they said, oh, what my parents or peers or whatever, they're telling me that's not interesting. But now we have these exciting new voices that are presenting these teachings I have not heard before. Then a lot of this really caught people's attention. So, like, personally, I've listened to many hours of Sam Harris's podcast, for example, because I was interested in hearing what he had to say and sort of what is the forefront of how people understand what is the brain, what is language, how do we understand people's behavior, all these sorts of questions, which I think are naturally interesting to people. Sam Harris, made a very he was a very prolific, and I think he still is a very prolific podcaster who would put on these shows. Right, so here, like another example, Are We Alone in the Universe? A conversation with Neil deGrasse Tyson. So Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's of course a prominent public scientist figure, and I'm sure that the topic of this universe has to do with cosmology, because Sam Harris is talking with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and they'll be talking about the current establishment view on the nature of the universe. Right. Okay, so enough about background stuff. Okay, I just wanted to show this because on the preview image, I showed this image of this guy wearing this experimental headset with reverse pass-through VR. So it's like there's cameras pointing at his eyes and they're tracking his eye movements. That sort of thing, eye tracking, it's a very common way in which people gain empirical data for various psychological experiments. Anyways, this VR technology, it tracks and records the eyes, and then it projects it on screens on the outside. So it's like not just like my glasses where you see my eyes, but what if my glasses had cameras facing my eyes and then screens facing you so that you could see my eyes? Wouldn't that be wild? Anyways. Yeah. I'll just one more point about VR and meta stuff. So I mentioned like Steven Pinker and these people and experimental psychology. So why is there so much interest in experimental psychology? And why does it receive so much like research grants and that sort of stuff? One of the big reasons is because it has huge industry applications. So, for example, with linguistics, I mentioned natural language processing, stuff like that. Like with linguistics proper, and this is one thing that I pretty early on realized as I was going through linguistics, is that, you know, if you are just interested in languages and you want to study languages, then maybe linguistics actually isn't the best place for you to be. Like, if you're working at the reception desk of a hotel, then you could learn all sorts of languages and then practice them with people traveling from all over the world, right? To actually learn and practice languages, maybe being a hotel receptionist or working that sort of job, service industry at some cosmopolitan big city, that might actually be more interesting to you. On the other hand, with a lot of linguistics, what they're trying to do eventually is develop systems like natural language processing, which basically could involve developing technology with computers such that you don't even need to hire a translator, because your software will do that for you. Google Pixel Translator. So it's almost like linguistics is no longer largely about humans and what language is to humans. More so it's about how do we model what humans do with computers and then develop that sort of stuff into computer systems.
How to translate with your Google Pixel Buds. Your Pixel Buds can help you converse in different languages with an Android phone and the Google Translate app. Activate the assistant by saying, "Hey Google," or press and hold the earbud, then say,
"Help me speak Spanish."
Help me speak Spanish.
To launch conversation mode on the Translate app. When you're ready to speak to someone in another language, press and hold the earbud and speak in your native language.
Good afternoon. What are the menu specials today?
Buenas tardes. ¿Cuáles son los especiales del menú hoy?
Tap the microphone under the language you'd like translated when they're ready to respond. When the person responds, the translated message will play directly into your Pixel Bud.
So, if you're in graduate school or something, and you're looking at the job market and you said, maybe I don't want to become a professor, then what sorts of stuff might people be looking at? One area might be to be working with one of these super big tech companies. So I personally have met people that have gone on to work for companies like that. But then what do you find yourself doing? Are you like studying more languages, comparing them? Maybe you're annotating data sets or doing something or giving some guidance in order to develop solutions like these Google Pixel Buds.
To learn more, visit the Google Pixel Buds Help Center.
All right, so there we go. I made an ad for Google without even being paid a cent to do it. Just kidding. They provide me this valuable service, this platform of being able to stream here. So maybe the least I could do is show off some Google products. Anyways, back to experimental psychology. So techniques like eye tracking and stuff like that, what they're able to do is they're able to give you quantitative data. So going back to the previous stream, we were talking about how Jacques Ellul's sense of technique, a lot of finding the best technique means doing optimization of some kind. So in this sense, like, suppose you're looking and you're answering the question like, how is it that a consumer makes a decision? Well, you might have a shelf that's marked out like all the areas, what certain products are, and then you might track a user's eyes to say, okay, it looks like, the user looks at the middle shelf the most. They don't really look at the top and the bottom unless they can't find what they want in the middle of the shelf, right? You might come to that sort of conclusion by studying that data. And then what you'd be able to do is you could take all the data points and work on developing a model that could predict how do we get people to, for example, and then you could look at another connection like, is there a connection between what a person's looking at and what they buy? So let's suppose that the stuff people look at the most is the stuff that people are most likely to buy. So making these connections, people look in this area the most, people buy the most of what they look at, then why don't we put the products that will actually give us the best returns, the best like value in terms of like profit? How do we put the most profitable items to sell for the business? Let's put those in the middle. And then we could put like the other stuff towards the top and the bottom, so it is available to customers if they want it. But just if people are making the default choice, because they just tend to look in this middle area, then we could go ahead and we could sell them stuff. So that might be a sort of thing you might look at with experimental psychology, looking at how people make decisions or choose things. So with that being said, let us segue into this topic of cognitive biases. So in economics, at a very basic level, you might talk about a consumer. So I just called him like an Econ-o-maton in the title for the stream. But there's this idea of what you could call the rational consumer. So I pulled up Investopedia article here, so on rational choice theory. So let me just read this one paragraph. Rational choice theory states that individuals use rational calculations to make rational choices and achieve outcomes that are aligned with their own personal objectives. These results are also associated with maximizing an individual's self-interest. Using rational choice theory is expected to result in outcomes that provide people with greatest benefit and satisfaction given the limited options they have available. So like a really simple idea behind or application of rational choice theory would be, suppose I offer you the same item, and one of them is more expensive and the other one is less expensive, but they're both like the same product. So if you're making a rational choice, then you're going to try to maximize your self-interest you're going to choose the cheaper one, because if I'm paying the same price for the item, then why would I not choose the cheaper one? That would be a rational choice on the basis that it's rational to choose a cheaper item, all other things being equal. So you could read more about rational choice theory if that interests you. But I only bring that up to talk about cognitive biases. So one of the reasons that people started to talk about cognitive biases, which are, quote, systematic patterns of deviation from norm and or rationality and judgment. So these are patterns by which people are not behaving, quote unquote, rationally, but instead are choosing to do something that would go against the naive assumptions of rational choice theory that, oh yeah, consumers just behave in this sort of way. So let's just go down here and look at a couple of these cognitive biases, and we'll use it with a simple example of if somebody's picking some stuff off a shelf. So, okay, so here's one. Anchoring is a type of cognitive bias. So, the tendency to rely too heavily or anchor on one trait or piece of information when making decisions, usually the first piece of information acquired on the subject. So, let's suppose somebody is looking to buy dishwasher detergent, okay? And the only thing they know about dishwasher detergent is that they had heard that Zoomers eat Tide Pods. So this consumer, let's suppose that they're a Zoomer, they very much want to defy this stereotype. So even if the Tide Pods are the best priced item, of rationality would govern that they buy the Tide Pod. Just having this piece of information that, oh, you're just a Zoomer that eats Tide Pods. They'll anchor on that, and then they'll say, I'm actually going to buy this other competitive item, a little bit lower on the shelf, and pay a little bit more money because I don't want people to think I'm a Tide Pod munching Zoomer. That would be an example of a type of anchoring cognitive bias. What are some other ones? Okay, yeah, so here's another one. They call it the clustering illusion. The tendency to overestimate the importance of small run streaks or clusters in large samples of random data. That is, seeing phantom patterns. So, let's try to think of an example that might have to do with like a shelf at a store. Okay, so I have to make up a little story. Let's suppose that one of the employees at this store is kind of difficult. So every day he rolls some dice or generates some random numbers and then determines to just mess up certain areas of the shelf. So it's entirely random in the sense he actually flips a coin or to determine where he causes chaos. Now, a customer comes in and they don't know or understand that it is a random process, that is this employee purposely implying some randomness device to do this. So they say, oh, the Tide Pods are always knocked down. Because, let's say, 3 days in a row they saw it was the Tide Pods that were knocked down, whereas the, the generic market brand of the detergent was not knocked down. So they determine that Tide Pods are cursed or something. So they don't buy the Tide Pods. Now, there was nothing wrong or defective about the Tide Pods. In actuality, and it's only in actuality, right? Because I'm making up and saying we're assuming this is the case, because I'm making up like a thought experiment. Then the reason behind why Tide Pods would just because, he rolls the dice and Tide Pod group was assigned number 5, and the number 5 was rolled more than some other number. Anyways, if you went down this list, you could come up and make up examples of all of these. The point of bringing this up is that we start with some sort of assumption, like those made with rational choice theory, and such a theory, it's oversimplified. It's found to be not useful enough in predicting people's actual behavior. So then psychologists and other researchers might come up with mechanisms such as these cognitive biases in order to explain the seemingly irrational aspects of people's behavior. Now, you could ask the question, in what sense are people being irrational, right? So if you're just going by rational choice theory and assuming rational consumer is based on some kind of optimization, like what a rational consumer wants to do is to maximize their, amount of money that they pay for utils. So utils econ, let's look up this term. All right. Utility, according to the Investopedia team. Utility is a term in economics that refers to total satisfaction received from consuming a good or service. Economic theories based on rational choice usually assume that consumers will strive to maximize their utility. So once again, we're returning to this this issue of optimization, right? So by rational choice theory, you're assuming that what customers want to do is to maximize their utils, their utility. And then when people don't, then it's like, oh no, what's going on? How do you reason with that? So one response to that is to come up with all these things like cognitive biases to describe and explain these phenomenon. And then you could do like experimental psychology to sort of explore the nature of these cognitive biases, these constructs that you come up with as explanatory devices. Right. Okay, so a util is an artificial measure of a consumer's satisfaction from consuming a good. So we could talk about like utility as the thing that you want to maximize, but then just talk in like theory, then people might talk about a util. Now note that all this stuff is also related to a philosophical branch thing termed utilitarianism, which might say not just in terms of economic stuff, but maybe you want to shape or run a whole society on the principle of maximizing utility for everyone. So I'll just read this first sentence. Utilitarianism is a family of normative ethical theories. So we talked about this word normative, like making a normative claim. You're applying a value judgment. That is to say, we think this thing is good and like other stuff is bad. You're applying a value judgment that prescribes actions that maximize happiness and well-being for all affected individuals. Although different varieties of utilitarianism admit different characterizations, the basic idea behind all of them is in some sense to maximize utility. Okay, so all these different topics that we've been discussing on the stream are all coming together, right? We have my previous stream I called parameterization of everything. So talking about how nowadays, starting the point of discussion with Mark Zuckerberg's his metaverse, there's this way in which they want everybody's actions to be tracked and quantified. Now, why would you want to track and quantify everything? Then looking at this Jacques Ellul book, we could see that the people that design these systems, they're employing some kind of technique. And when you employ a technique, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get the best of something. You're trying to optimize something. So that would be obvious to see, like, if you're coming up with a technique to say, what is the technique I employ to build as many chairs as I can in an hour? And that might involve setting up a factory in a particular way and all sorts of different things, using particular machines and so on and so forth. So using technique, you're optimizing something. Now today we're starting to talk about what are the things that people would try to optimize. So we have this throwback to this term, utilitarianism. And once again, we see the mention of, I think this was Jeremy Bentham of the Panopticon. Was that Jeremy Bentham? Good search. Panopticon. Oh, yep, he was the guy who talked about the Panopticon. Okay, so we're going back to the Panopticon. All right, so the tradition of modern utilitarianism began with Jeremy Bentham. So he was born 1748, died 1832, and continued with such philosophers as John Stuart Mill, Henry Sidgwick, R.M. Hare, and Peter Singer. The concept has been applied towards social welfare economics, the dropping of the atomic bombs of World War II, the crisis of global poverty, the ethics of raising animals for food, and the importance of avoiding existential risks to humanity. Okay, so all of those topics are things we could talk about a different time. But the general point being that one of the ways in which a lot of this discussion of things like the Monty Hall Problem and Nash Equilibrium, topics recommended by many of the audience members here, is that people have brought these things up as examples or little problems or puzzles by which studying of cognitive biases and things like that could be demonstrated. So let me say that in a different way. If you just thought about these problems like the Monty Hall problem, and you just thought about it from like a purely mathematical system, not thinking about winning prizes or stuff like that, but you actually went through and just calculated stuff and worked through the problems coolly and calmly, let's say you had a lot of time to do it, then you would come up with a solution or an answer that might go against what might be your gut instinct or your reaction to what this problem is. So what your gut instinct reaction, or just, oh yeah, it's this, right? That sort of thing people might talk about as being a kind of cognitive bias. I brought up on the screen, I flashed up that Thinking Fast and Slow book by these people, this researcher, Daniel Kahneman. Another term associated with cognitive biases would be like heuristics. So what a heuristic is it's described as like a mental shortcut. Okay, here we go. We have a definition that comes right up here. So a heuristic is a mental shortcut that allows people to solve problems and make judgments quickly and efficiency. These rule of thumb strategies shorten decision-making time and allow people to function without constantly stopping to think about their next course of action. So implicit with this definition is that when you're applying a heuristic, you're not taking the time to slowly step through and be rational about stuff, to reason from first principles, whatever you want to call it. Rather than doing that, maybe you found a path that just works most of the time. So you go to your default heuristic to do something, even if that heuristic might mean embracing a cognitive bias. So that's heuristic is related to cognitive bias in that people might say, oh yeah, cognitive biases. So are these like all the ways people could be stupid? Like why don't we just be more rational? And then one answer to that sort of dismissal of cognitive biases are dumb or something would be to say, well, because maybe people act in this way because oftentimes it's more efficient, or it makes sense to act in these ways under the constraint of time, or something like that. So I'm not going to talk about the Monty Hall problem specifically or Nash Equilibrium, but what I did hope to do, just bringing up this stuff, is to sort of say, how is it that you or I, or anyone you might talk to about Nash Equilibrium or the Monty Hall problem, why is it that you're talking about these things to begin with? So I kind of gave my own personal trail that I followed to learn about these things, which was going through pop psychology type of stuff into experimental psychology, cognitive science, linguistics, to show, why are people talking about these things? A lot of the times it'll come down to talking about some sort of cognitive bias, heuristics type research, and the reasons that people would be looking at that stuff to begin with would be in order to optimize something a la utilitarianism of some kind, though it will probably come under the names of different stuff, maybe science-based policy, scientific governance, any number of terms might be used instead of utilitarianism, because utilitarianism kind of sounds like something tried hundreds of years ago that failed, so you don't want to use that brand if it's not going to get you anything. Cool. Oh, I wanted to just give a link to this fellow, Luke Smith. He's pretty well known on the internet. I've been following him for a while because he was actually in a linguistics graduate program like me, a little bit ahead of me, both in prestige and years in school. But I found him sort of as I was naturally converging and looking at a lot of these topics, and then I found his stuff, and it was like, oh, he had already made videos and talked about a lot of these things that I would say I had, independent of him, started to look at and come to my own thoughts about. So, for example, here, I've been talking about economics. What do they mean by being rational choice theory, utilitarianism, all that stuff. So Luke Smith, he made this podcast, so notrelated.xyz, that's the URL for his non-YouTube hosting of these, but the blurb here says, and let me zoom in, are humans rational? What would that even mean? Does it mean we follow the laws of formal logic, or does it mean we only care about getting a positive end result? So that would be kind of utilitarianism and positive result. Some modern psychologists, often in the vein of the heuristics and biases program, a la Daniel Kahneman, so that was that thinking fast and slow guy. Heuristics and biases here, that would be like cognitive biases. And Amos Tversky, so this Kahneman, he worked with this Amos Tversky researcher, and the book is about the research they did together. Often implicitly assume that these are the same thing, that humans are often gravely miscalibrated in our sense of reason. We are logically broken. So it's like, oh, we could be perfect and logical, but because of heuristics and cognitive biases, we're going off the rail and not choosing what's best for us. Some proponents of libertarian paternalism propose that this illogicalness should be actively mitigated by governmental policy and nudging. So there was this popular book called Nudge. Okay, so I'm not going to read the rest of that, but this is just something else you could check out and look at if you're interested in the stuff that I've talked about today. I listened to this probably over a year ago, maybe over 2 years ago. But going through my own journey, as I've been describing, I came upon this topic and sort of, I would say I'm kind of past it in many ways. But, yeah, Luke Smith shows how, he came to that thing, and then he has some stuff to say about it too. And then, as his attention isn't focused on cognitive biases and all this too, then I think it would be fair to say too that he has kind of passed it and that he has other things to talk about besides heuristics and cognitive biases. All right. So let's see. Why don't we go ahead? We'll just read a little bit of Jacques Ellul. Of course, if anybody has any comments or questions or anything like that, or there's just something that you want me to show up here or that you want to take a look at, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just go ahead and continue with this book, and I will make comments about some of these things that we've talked about. So I did my my take on stuff like Nash Equilibrium and the Monty Hall Problem. I'm sorry if that wasn't satisfactory too, of the type of exploration you were looking for the people that asked about that. But there's an endless number of things you might look at. So another question to ask is, hey, why are you not looking into Nash Equilibrium? Did you know that researching Nash Equilibrium could change your life? Right? So why am I not saying that? Well, I'm saying that looking at stuff like the Monty Hall Problem and Nash Equilibrium, right, it could be fun and interesting to look at for a day or two. But if you look at the broader research program and stuff that those fall under, then you could determine, like, is this a sort of research program? Is this a methodology that I would want to dedicate my life to working in this particular way? Or might you say, I don't think that is actually what I want to do? In a similar kind of analogous way, it's like, suppose you're like a marathon runner. So you optimize like your health and fitness and stuff so that you could do the best job at running a marathon. You might do a very good job at running marathons, but somebody might look at you and say, like, look, dude, they're doing that. You're really injuring your knees and stuff over a long term. And also, too, you're missing out because you don't have the time to build a lot of upper body strength. And then also, when you aren't building, you don't want to build too much upper body strength because that's more weight and that'll make your marathon times worse. So the person that chooses to specialize in marathon running, not to tell them, yes, do that, or no, don't do that, but whenever you focus yourself on like some vein of research or some particular path, then necessarily, because we're limited by time, you have to do what you're doing to the exclusion of all the sorts of other things that you might be doing. So why am I not looking at Nash Equilibrium? Because I think that there's other more interesting things to look at, but to understand like where Nash Equilibrium and the Monty Hall Problem fit, like who was interested in it and why, to me that's a more interesting issue. So we're here and we're talking about the technological society, and also too, I think that talking about various research programs and why people have chosen to look at particular questions or issues, that is also, I think that could be a worthwhile thing to talk about. So let's at least get into this text a little bit. Historical development. So we just finished last time like 40 or 50 pages of just defining what technique is, and we skipped a bunch of pages where he was just saying how other researchers' definitions of technique were not as inclusive or as complete as his. Now we'll look at historical development. Primitive technique. It is scarcely possible to give here a history of technique in its universal aspect as we have just defined it. We are now only beginning to know a little of the history of mechanical technique. It is enough to recall the works of André Leroy-Grand, Richard Lefebvre de Noët, Marc Bloch, and others. But the full history of technique has yet to be written. My book is not a history, I shall speak in a historical vein only when it is necessary to the understanding of the technical problem in society today. Oh, we have a comment by Reaper. He says, sounds like you were talking about the parameterization of academic research. You know, I like this comment. We could talk about and research this whole big topic of the meta study. Look, everything's coming together again. We have the word meta, right? So, of course, there's people that do, like, research of particular stuff. But then there's also meta-analysis. What is meta-analysis? Is it study of the metaverse? In a way, I suppose it is. Rather, a meta-analysis is the statistical analysis that combines the results of multiple scientific studies. Meta-analyses can be performed when there are multiple scientific studies addressing the same question, with each individual study reporting measurements that are expected to have some degree of error. The aim then is to use approaches from statistics to derive a pooled estimate closest to the unknown common truth based on how this error is perceived. So literally here, you do have a kind of parameterization of academic research where you're saying all of these studies are kind of similar and that they're looking at the same sort of thing. And then if you aggregate these studies and characterize them and say, okay, these studies say this thing causes cancer, whatever sort of question we're talking about. By doing a study of the studies, then, right, one could hope to make sense of the big C that is called academic research. So, that is a thing. Yes, this might be a good thread to go down more. If we actually do more research on research together, that would be cool. Okay. Technical activity is the most primitive activity of man. There is the technique of hunting, of fishing, of food gathering, and later of weapons, clothing, and building. And here we face a mystery. What is the origin of this activity? It is a phenomenon which admits of no complete explanation. By patient research, one finds areas of imitation, transitions from one technical form to another, examples of penetration. But at the core, there is a closed area, the phenomenon of invention. Okay, so technical activity is the most primitive. I mean, this makes sense in, like, people have to do stuff to survive, basically. Alright. It can be shown that technique is absorbed into man's psychology and depends upon that psychology and upon what has been called technical motivation, but we have no explanation of how an activity which once did not exist came to be. Okay, so just one thing I thought of really quick here, like the way humans catch and eat fish, whether that's fishing with a net or spear fishing or whatever it is that you might be, that's a distinct thing from, like, if you're just a bigger fish and you chase down and you eat a little fish. So the humans will use technology like near nets and spears, and then they'll teach each other, like, ways in which to do such and such activity in a ways where we might look at the various animals in the world and say that maybe they do it instinctually. There seems to be a sense in which the way humans go about work and do things is different from how an animal would naturally do things. Alright, continuing. How did man come to domesticate animals, to choose certain plants to cultivate? The motivating force, we are told, was religious, and the first plants were cultivated with some magical end in mind. This is likely, but how was the selection made, and how did it happen that the majority of these plants were edible? How did man come to refine metals and make bronze? Was it chance, as the legend of the discovery of Phoenician glass has it? This is obviously not the answer. one is left with an enigma, and there is some point in emphasizing that there is here the same mysterious quality as in the appearance of life itself. Each primitive operation of man implies the bringing of such an enormous gulf between instinct and technical act that a mystic aura hovers about all subsequent development. Our modern worship of technique derives from man's ancestral worship of the mysterious and marvelous character of its own handiwork. Okay, so we have a whole lot going on here. I don't know if I would say, everybody worships technique, but he's at least saying that there is this worship of technique going on. I'll just show one modern manifestation of all this stuff. You may have heard this term, transhumanism. And it's directly related to technology. Is this a meme or is this someone trying to be serious about it? Okay, so this seems to be like an unironic side about transhumanism. So it's like following that evolution image you have probably seen. And then you can see this person, he has like a briefcase and a phone. So these are various technologies. And then he becomes like VR. And then look, now he's taller and his legs are robotic. And then finally he's left his like skin and bones body and he's fully a robot. Maybe his mind is uploaded into this machine somehow and he's faster and stronger and all that. But you could see, I'm not saying this stuff is true or right, but if one compared, who would win in a fight? This robot or this, hominid? Then presumably the answer is the robot. Who knows what sorts of lasers and stuff he could shoot out of his hands. He could work, over 24 hours without getting tired. Who knows what that robot could do. But this is the idea of you building the technology and then eventually you merge with the technique or the technology and then you're stronger than one could possibly imagine. Okay, we have a comment from Reaper. He says, in modern parlance, people say they ritualize X, i.e. someone has their daily coffee ritual or has a ritual before they commit code to a version control system. Okay, yeah, so let's look back at the Jacques Ellul text. Right, so in what sense, look, we'll accept, I think Reaper makes a interesting point here. Worship of technology. So, for example, you could even say me here, right? By going through and keeping up with tech news, multiple times a week, right? Is this kind of paying my due to technology in some respect? You could have an analysis that says that is the case. Or on one of my first streams, I pulled up this site that I often look at, skimfeed.com. What this website is it's an aggregator of all these different tech news sites. So Hacker News, this is often targeting venture capitalists targeting nerds to build disruptive software products. The Verge, Apple Insider, Slashdot, all these sites, right? So, am I doing a kind of ritual if I browse through these headlines to see what's happening in technology news? Okay, Reaper has a couple additional contents. He says, what is funny, obviously, is the kind of religious or even pagan aesthetic of worship being used to describe modern action. Yeah, just even look at all these images of transhumanist stuff, right? It's kind of the language being used has an overt religious undertone to it. And then this famous book in modern times by Yuval Noah Harari. His book, he wrote this book titled Homo Deus, where Deus is God, so like man as God. And then this book goes through how humans and technology and stuff are working together and what the future is going to be like. Oh, another term that we could look at some other time is futurology or future studies, which is the systematic, interdisciplinary, and holistic study of social and technological advancement. So key here that technological advancement is one of the huge things of when people are going, getting all excited talking about the future. One of the big ways in which you could see this in art, music, film, all this, is the emphasis, very big emphasis on technological advancement and other environmental trends, often for the purpose of exploring how people will live and work in the future. All right, returning to Reaper comments. People seem to spontaneously do this and sometimes begs question if there's something innate in humans that causes them to do this, i.e. rituals or religion is inside us. In the 90s, tech bros had a ritual of reinstalling Windows once a month. Well, I think that the Linux bros in the 2020s have a ritual of going to distrowatch.com and trying out and reinstalling new Linux distributions instead of actually troubleshooting problems on their computers. So maybe there is something inherent. Maybe there is something about people just resetting, restarting, and doing the same things again and again, even if they're trying to get away from some problem. Interesting. Reaper says, you mentioned the language about tech stuff. Design bros would say tech utopianism from different authors often share a similar design language. Yeah. So I think, and this is related to our reading here of the Jacques Ellul book, which is to say, you could generalize. So Jacques Ellul is using this term technique to generalize like all sorts of diverse activities that people do. He's also subsuming it under this obsession with technique. So I think too, various techniques, right? You could sub and classify techniques like in the previous section. I remember that he was saying, or I described them as like there is like political technique, monetary technique, and then like human or psychological technique, something like that. And note that you cannot forget about the psychological technique stuff. This Jacques Ellul fellow himself wrote this book called Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitudes. So clearly to him, the idea of techniques you use to persuade people and give people particular attitudes was something that he paid a lot of attention to. Yeah. All right. So let's at least. How long is this primitive technique section? Oh, he goes to Christianity and technique next. Okay. Well, we'll go down his primitive technique a little bit. So actually, just looking ahead at the headlines, that it seems that what he's describing now is his idea of sort of base man. We don't know a lot about, but he's saying that like kind of pre-Christian civilization man, I think, is how he's trying to divide this section. So we might talk about the caveman or the Stone Age or something like that. So it seems he's kind of talking about that. That's why he brings up examples like, was it hunting and fishing or something? Oh yeah, hunting, fishing, and food gathering. So he's kind of talking about this caveman stereotype. Oh, another pop culture term. So if you meet somebody who wants to throw back and sort of just act like a caveman, they might be a person that favors anarcho-primitivism. No class, no patriarchy, no borders, no nations, no kings, no gods. Return to monkey. So I'm not advocating that, but just to say, there's like a lot of these ideas you could read about. This is a Jacques Ellul from the mid 20th century, and even still today, then you get these people that are creating or becoming parts of these movements that are motivated by ideas that have been around and been discussed for a long time. So Reaper says, some of this discussion from the book reminds me of Jung. I haven't read Jung myself, so if there's anything specific that Jung has said that you think is pertinent or like some idea, feel free to type it there. I can take a look. Oh, here you go. The caveman stereotype is similar to Jung's archetype or archetypal images. Yeah, maybe. I mean, like a term that came to mind, for example, is this. I think you would say it's like a trope in sort of romantic period literature of the noble savage. So let's look briefly at the noble savage. The noble savage is a literary stock character. So maybe this stock character is kind of like this archetype who embodies the concept of the indigent, outsider, wild human, or other who has not been corrupted by civilization and therefore symbolizes humanity's innate goodness. Yeah, so he's like wild and free, not corrupted by society. Besides appearing in many works of fiction and philosophy, the stereotype was also heavily employed in early anthropological works. I bet Brave New World is mentioned here. Yeah, so in Brave New World, mentioning Aldous Huxley, because Aldous Huxley read and spread Jacques Ellul to English-speaking audiences. In this book, Brave New World, a character, I think you could call him the protagonist or one of the main characters, could be called one of these noble savage types. Okay. It has not been sufficiently emphasized that technique has evolved along two distinct paths. There's the concrete technique of homo faber, man the maker. So faber is like the root, like fabricate. I think in some other languages that root will be like the word for factory. You could even try it. Fabri. What is that? Fabrique. Oh, that's their verb. Okay, no, here we go. Feminine noun. La fabrique. A factory. Dans le village voisin, il y a une fabrique. Okay, I'm going to try to read French. Anyways, the point, root there, homo faber, man the maker, to which we are accustomed, which poses the problem we have normally studied. There is also the technique of a more or less spiritual order, which we call magic. So I'll make a note here to say, let us track how magic is discussed in this book, if indeed we do continue to bring up this, continue to read through this work. It may seem questionable, nevertheless. Magic is a technique in the strictest sense of the word, as has been clearly demonstrated by Marcel Mauss. Magic developed along with other techniques as an expression of man's will to obtain certain results of a spiritual order. To attain them, man made use of an aggregate of rites, formulas, and procedures which, once established, do not vary. Strict adherence to form is one of the characteristics of magic. Forms and rituals, mass which never vary, the same kind of prayer wheels, the same ingredients for mystical drugs, the formulae for divination, and so on. All these became set and were passed on. The slightest variation in word or gesture would alter the magical equilibrium. Oh, Reaper says, bring up these key concepts. The enchantment of technology. This volume builds on works of numerous scholars, including Jacques Ellul and Jean Bourne, on the phenomenological and spiritual aspects of technology. Carl Jung on, and he's typing. All right, I'll make note of this work. The enchantments of technology. Yeah, with respect to magic, I'll just bring up that with a lot of this this whole genre of cyberpunk. So let's look at cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is a genre of science fiction in the dystopian future setting that tends to focus on a combination of low life and high tech. So I bring up cyberpunk because, like this Snow Crash novel that we were talking about, like this thing is considered kind of cyberpunk. See, genre cyberpunk. And in cyberpunk, one of the big tropes is you get all of these societies where computers and androids and all this stuff is everywhere. So like I'll just search cyberpunk on Google. It'll probably, a lot of it will be from this recent game Cyberpunk, but the game does a good job bringing up a lot of the visual tropes associated with this genre. So, you know, a lot of Asian neon lights, cities, stuff like that, because these Asian cities take the high-tech stuff to a new level, and they have this certain aesthetic with the electric lights, all this sort of stuff. Like maybe some shady love hotel, more neon sights. This guy's got mechanical hands. Of course, you're going to have actual computers, you know, people running their awesome Linux distributions, doing some hacking, some security, probably some big finance, corruption, intrigue. So all these things are tropes of cyberpunk. Another big trope, though, of cyberpunk is this spiritual or religious aspect, because there's this idea that, you know, you are kind of creating your own reality in a certain way through the technology. There's kind of base normal reality, but then, you know, whether it's real, whether it's fake, like what is it, people are able to have and generate all sorts of experiences that might be indistinguishable from magic. So like I played this game called Shadowrun. Now I played like the video game of it, but I guess it's based on a tabletop game. But I just wanted to bring up with this game, which could be considered, like if I search the word cyberpunk, yeah, it's considered, here they said it combines genres cyberpunk, urban fantasy, and crime, with occasional elements of conspiracy, horror, and detective fiction. So the point of bringing this up is like this thing, you could clearly call it a type of cyberpunk work. But if you look at the sort of characters it has, then there's going to be characters that are associated with magic in a lot of ways. So I'll just read this thing right here. Oh, we got augmented and virtual reality. I see right here. All right. The most notable archetypes are street samurai characters who have heavily augmented their bodies with cyberware and bioware and focus on physical combat. So think, you know, augmented mechanical arm to swing a sword harder and faster. Adepts, characters who have magical abilities that increase their physical and sometimes mental combat abilities. So magical abilities explicitly mentioned there. Faces, highly charismatic characters who specialize in negotiations and social manipulation. Oh. Propaganda and the formation of man's attitudes. Very interesting. hackers, or called deckers in this game, experts in electronic surveillance, security, and augmented/virtual reality monitoring, combat and response, riggers who augment their brains to achieve fine control over vehicles and drones. So, like, use your brain or a little control pad to have a drone fight for you. Anyways, the whole point of bringing up, like, cyberpunk genre and then that Shadowrun, an example of a game or a series of games, whatever you want to call it, that that are exemplars of cyberpunk, is that this idea with magic, technology, and like futurology, science fiction, they all come together in this way where it's not just like once you have all this technology that magic vanishes. Rather, magic and that sort of thing, like having rituals and sorts of things, it might have a different looking external form, but this sort of magic in the sense that people do actions in a very particular way to get particular results, even if they don't understand exactly how it happens, and using forces outside themselves, all that sort of stuff. It's still all very present here, even if the people that are working on these things might consider themselves past organized religion in a sense. Even if they consider themselves past organized religion in some way, what they're doing is then they're describing like new emergent occultic and religious things that, well, they're at least thinking and writing about them. How they themselves associate with them, I can't say, but they're at least writing them up and coming up with these ideas. Okay, so continuing talking on about the magic here. There's a relationship between the ready-made formula and a precise result. The gods being propitiated obey such an invocation out of necessity. All the more reason that they be given no opportunity to escape compliance, because the invocation is not correctly formulated. This fixity is a manifestation of the technical character of magic. When the best possible means of obtaining the desired result has been found, why change it? Every magical means, in the eyes of the person who uses it, is the most efficient one. Okay, so this line here was interesting. So ready-made formula and a precise result. All right. Sorry to bring up. Keep on opening and closing a window. Should perhaps get better organized here. So this Snow Crash guy, remember I mentioned this line Stevenson wrote, in the beginning was the command line, right? So what is a command line? Well, I mean, like, command line is in a computer. We'll look at a computer terminal. And this is another big thing in this whole cyberpunk imagery. It's like, you know, you type a line. You're a hacker, right? You type a line. You issue a command on the computer system, and you aren't sitting there right then and there writing the entire program, but you sit there and you just type out a command. You know what the command is that you want to type, because it might be like the name of a program or something. And then when you type the command, then it might enact and do all sorts of stuff. Now, going into metaverse land, going into the 21st century, you could run a program like just sitting down at a computer and typing something, and then you animate a swarm of drones. You spawn up a new virtual world. You do all these sorts of things. So in that way, that is like saying there is a relationship between the ready-made formula and a precise result. When you write a program that is a well-written program, then it is such that, the program does what you expect it to do. You write a program to, be an online store that handles transactions in a particular way. Then if the program is well written and assuming all the hardware and stuff is working, then when you launch that software into production, that'll be what happens. So you'll have a ready-made formula, this program that you created or you bought or you hired someone else to write, whatever, and then a precise result. Then the software operates how it is supposed to operate. Okay, the gods being propitiated obey such an invocation out of necessity. Right, so this is to say, like, you build this giant programmable matter, drones, robot, car factories, whatever it is, then all of this is subject to your command. You run a program, you operate it, then as long as you do things in the right series of steps, then all this machinery responds to you how you tell it to. All the more reason that they be given no opportunity to escape compliance because invocation is not correctly formulated. This fixity is a manifestation of the technical character of magic. When the best possible means of obtaining the desired result has been found, why change it? Every magical means in the eyes of the person who uses it is the most efficient one. In the spiritual realm, magic displays all the characteristics of a technique. It is a mediator between man and, quote, the higher powers, end quote, just as other techniques mediate between man and matter. It leads to efficacy because it subordinates the powers of the gods to man, and it secures a predetermined result. It affirms human power in that it seeks to subordinate the gods to men, just as technique serves to cause nature to obey. Ooh, okay, so I think, this here, like, I don't think you should use, magic, like, call upon powers you shouldn't call upon. I don't think you should do that. But, yeah, this is a description of, like, what oftentimes people mean by magic. People might dismiss magic and say, like, oh, that's silly, that's superstition, right? But then somebody might be thinking of magic much more broadly in that they say, like, really, if I program a drone to go fly out and kill somebody, that when I type on the command line, how is that different from, like, a wizard issuing a fireball to do the same thing? Like, the technology is indistinguishable from magic. So I guess in a similar way, then I would say in the same way that I think that one shouldn't try to call upon certain powers to, like, determine life and death or sickness of another human being. Like, that's not your place to do that. Then in a similar way, I would say, so why does that mean it's okay to do it with technology? Is that just like a different form of magic? So Jacques Ellul is bringing up an interesting connection between technology and magic here. Let's see. Magic clearly displays the characteristics of primitive technique, as Leroy Grand indicates when he says that technique is a cloak for man, a kind of cosmic vestment. In his conflict with matter in his struggle to survive, man interposes an intermediary agency between himself and his environment, and this agency has a twofold function. It is a means of protection and defense. Alone, man is too weak to defend himself. It is also a means of assimilation. Through technique, man is able to utilize his prophet powers that are alien or hostile. He is able to manipulate his surroundings so that they are no longer merely his surroundings, but become a factor of equilibrium and of profit to him. Thus, as a result of technique, man transforms his adversaries into allies. I don't think I completely understand what he's saying here. I'll just give an example of something I thought of today. Like, you could think of like a hydroelectric dam. So hydroelectric dam. Then maybe in some sense, when you have a bunch of rushing, crashing water and stuff, you could say that that's a kind of natural obstacle or barrier to you, because it prevents you from like easily crossing the river or something like that. But if you're able to take and harness that sort of thing with technology, then like Jacques Ellul is saying, you could change it into profit. So, right, he says he is able to manipulate his surroundings so that they are no longer merely his surroundings, but become a factor of equilibrium and of profit to him. Thus, as a result of technique, a man transforms his adversaries into allies. Yeah, so just trying to think of an example of this, I bring up like a hydroelectric dam. I don't know if you'd call like a river your adversary, but at least figuratively, if you're like swimming against the water, or you're trying to get across, but the water's moving really fast and it's deep and dangerous. In that sense, you could call it like a natural barrier adversary type thing. Okay, we'll just go one more paragraph and then we'll stop reading, because it's getting challenging, but it's been a good stream so far. Oh, we have a comment here. Rasta O. I don't know if this guy is a legit person. I'm not going to respond to him until he verifies his humanness. Okay. These characteristics of material technique correspond perfectly to the characteristics of magical technique. There also, man is in conflict with external forces, which, with the world of mystery, spiritual powers, and mystical currents. But there too, man erects a barrier around himself, for he would not know how to defend himself by his own unaided intellect. He uses any means that will serve him both for defense and for adjustment. He turns to his own profit the hostile powers which are obliged to obey him by virtue of his magical formulas. Alright, Rasta Biden says he is real. So he says your mouse cursor is massive. I think maybe my screen resolution here is small. So maybe the mouse is massive because I'm using a very old monitor that has what I think you call it like a 4:3 aspect ratio or something. So it's an old style monitor. So if the cursor appears big, it's probably more of a function of the screen being small rather than the mouse being big. So proportionally it's big. Okay, Masson Orsell in a recent study confirms this. He shows that magic is basically a scholasticism of efficiency. Whoa, that's a lot of syllables there. Which man employs as an instrument against his environment. That magic is pragmatic. It has a precision that must be called objective. And that its efficiency is demonstrated only in certain, quote, consecrations or disqualifications, end quote. Mason Orsell rightly believes that magic preceded technique, in fact, that magic is the first expression of technique. Okay, so that paragraph to me, or that part of the paragraph, a lot of it was kind of word salad. How could magic precede technique if magic is the first expression of technique? Isn't he just equating magic and technique? Okay, I don't know. We're not too important to go into some kind of exegesis or analyze that too closely. We're mainly just reading this book to see what are the main things that are being said, not to determine what's being meant by every word put forth in this book. So I think that about does it for this stream today, unless we have any other questions or comments or things that people would like to talk about. Otherwise, I think we made some progress through this book, and we also talked about a lot of different things. We mentioned a lot of different things, and explored how different ideas or different like cultural tropes, terms, archetypes, how they all are connected in sort of an intellectual lineage, where it's like suddenly, cyberpunk metaverse. Is this just a bunch of random nerds? And it seems maybe it's not just a bunch of random nerds, but rather it is one of the most distilled expressions of a long program of developing a way in which society is. It's kind of a logical expression or conclusion of that sort of thing. And that would be what Jacques Ellul would call the technical society. Cool. Oh, okay, so Reaper says, tie in today's stream with the metaverse. Alright, so I'll just directly tie this in with the metaverse. So, let's just get a... we'll just get up some images to give us some context. So let's just relate the metaverse to like magic really quick. So you could think about what are the sorts of things that people would do or could do if they had magical powers. Like some of the things that you might do would be transport instantly from one place to another place. You might levitate. You might like shoot fireballs. You might create like a huge show of some kind with lots of lights and fancy things. You might summon a giant purple rapper, So we could look even at the sort of official stuff already put out with like the metaverse promo and stuff. And you could see how basically by plugging into the metaverse, look, there's levitating. You could be a floating torso. With the metaverse, one of the big things is basically to give everyday people the access to what might be considered magical powers through a simulation. So, can you physically teleport from one place to another? No, you don't physically teleport, though by evoking some command, clicking, I don't know how the interface would work, you could essentially teleport in the sense of, I was talking with this group of people in this room, and now suddenly I warp over here to this other sense. So it adds like a more like tactile, visual, audio dimension to it that would be different from like if I'm switching between two different chat windows or something. It's giving a more embodied experience of that. So you could say that the metaverse, how is it related to the stuff that we were talking about in today's stream? To the Jacques Ellul stuff, the metaverse basically gives people like a fast food version of magic, because they know they're doing it in kind of a fake world. But insofar as the metaverse and the reality one, I think I called it a one stream, insofar as you mash them together more, then your LARPing magic becomes like real magic. And how would this relate to all this cognitive bias and all that stuff? Nash Equilibrium, that sort of thing. I think all that stuff relates in with respect to, say, if you're a person who is making policies or trying to make like some big system like Facebook's with their metaverse, if you're trying to make the system to be a certain way, then they're going to be trying to optimize something. I don't think they're just going to let it run just straight. Instead, they're going to try to do something. So they might try to, let's say they try to optimize people meeting different people, something like that, right? Then they will, what sort of research would you do to try to make people meet different people? Well, then you might apply like research into heuristics and cognitive biases and all that sort of stuff to say, like, oh yeah, it seems people naturally, they only like to talk to people that are familiar with them. So they might take some sort of insight from behavioral experimental psychology to say, like, it seems most people only talk to the same 10 people. So how do we get people to talk to more other people? So the Facebook engineers might be like, ha ha ha, how about, if you don't flip the switch off, every once in a while we'll just add a random person to your room. So then you have to deal with a new random person, even if they're speaking Swahili. Oh wait, they're speaking Swahili. Let's turn on the automatic translation service. Oh, so now you can't use it. Language barrier is an excuse to say you guys don't understand each other, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of like a over-the-top example, but it could be a way by which, if Facebook or someone had a goal to say, like, let's optimize about our platform by saying people should meet people they don't know, then one way that they might do that would be like using software and forcing people through software to interact with people that normally they wouldn't interact with. And in fact, we already see this sort of thing already a lot, like any kind of team-based game. Like, let's say you're playing like League of Legends or like Fortnite or something. You might go into one of these games playing it with friends, but then the way that the game is designed is you can't just stay with your friend group and then have robot allies. Instead, they'll bring in some strangers, some people you don't know yet, and then you might have to interact with these people, even if let's say they're messing around and trolling you, and they do friendly fire and they kill your team and they make you lose the game. If you play one of these big sorts of games, you're probably going to have to deal with stuff like that, unless there's like software that says like friendly fire off or something. Anyways, that would be how the cognitive bias, experimental psychology, popular science, all that stuff I think is directly related, because all that stuff is basically the current state of the research that is going to be going into informing the policies and the decisions that people are trying to make. I mean, I'm not going to go do it here on stream because might get into some politically sensitive issues, but if you look at sort of what is the research that like Facebook or Microsoft or Google, like what are the researchers or areas of research that they're interested in, and like what sort of people are they funding, in many ways that is the sort of the forefront of this of research. With institutional research, a lot of the times will be what people in power want. Like they have this system where they have all these levers and switches so they could control things in a certain way. Then it's like, all right, but how do we know which levers to pull and which buttons to push? And then they'll go ahead and they'll fund research such that they get some guidance on how to employ the power structures that they have set up. And I'm not assuming that everybody who's doing this has evil intent or something. Like, I'm sure that there's people. Well, I'm not. I'll take that back. I'm not sure, but probably a lot of people go in to working at a company like Facebook saying, I'm going to get paid a lot of money and I'm going to help people connect with one another. They don't go in saying like, I'm going to be a social controller or whatever. They might really have had good experiences with like Facebook. Like I gave a couple examples of how I'm a low-key Zuckerberg defender because I've had good experiences using Facebook Marketplace, for example, or even maintaining contact with people that I met in different times and places. Facebook has provided a useful service in that regard. But you say, all right, they don't want Facebook to just continue as it is and just make like a nice stable platform. Instead, they want to have a direction to grow, something to do, right? So that's why Facebook rebrand as Meta, push all this sort of stuff. They have a direction. They don't just want to sit still. They want to find the best technique. And that's where I think talking about cognitive biases, heuristics, Nash Equilibrium, game theory, all these things come in because these are issues that people who are system designers are thinking about and trying to choose options with in order to optimize some goal. Cool. So I think that about does it for today's stream. Once again, feel free to leave comments or anything about future topics. Otherwise, I think we just keep on continuing through this Jacques Ellul book and also referring to and making sure that we cover topics that are brought up by you all, that we will continue to have an interesting show here. So I thank everybody who has taken the time to come out and join, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much, and see you next time.